Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I'm a little congested, but the show must go on, especially because today we will be beginning the monumental task of subdividing China. Yes, the Chinese, for too long, have been an overcrowded umbrella that is totally insufficient for representing the depth and complexity of China throughout the Middle Ages. And so today we will be examining the TANGREN, which I have classified as an infantry civilization, though that is kind of a misleading title. They'd be better termed a combined arms civilization, but we'll get to that a little later. Huge thanks to my collaborator on this video, longtime viewer of the channel, Dennis. He also helped me on a recent video for the Tangut. He helped me translate primary sources, and without him, this video would be much, much worse. Show him some love down in the comments section. Also, thanks as always to my mod squad for consultancy on the feasibility of various bonuses. If this is your first video on my channel, a brief summary of my approach. I go for historical authenticity, trying to be truer to history than the game currently is while staying within the confines of technically implementable bonuses and mechanics. If you want to see stuff that pushes the boundaries, go check out the LAVAnte-Garde section towards the end of the video. I am a hobbyist, not a historian. I have to simplify a lot. I get stuff wrong all the time. My sources are in the speaker notes of this slide, and all images are in the speaker notes of the slide where the image appears on. If you want to support me, do the YouTube stuff. Links in the description down below. Yada, yada, yada. Let's move on to the good stuff. Who were the TANGREN? Well, they were the Tang dynasty, successors to the Sui dynasty in 618 AD. The Tang were arguably the most successful medieval Chinese state. Only the Ming really comes close to challenging them for just how much they accomplished during the couple hundred years they were in power. The Sui, their predecessors, were very short-lived, and the Tang inherited a lot from them. So this civilization could cover the Sui as well, since the two were very heavily related. Now, what does TANGREN mean? Well, it means people of Tang. You can think of ren being like a Mandarin suffix, kind of like ease. And the term was used in period, though sparingly. The rulership of the Tang dynasty possibly had Xianbei roots, who were like proto kind of Mongols, and they were notably one of the most open and culturally heterogeneous Chinese states that has ever existed. Buddhism, for example, gained power for the first time during the Tang dynasty, gaining so much power that they actually ended up cracking down on it in 845. And this allowed them to be an incredibly unique Chinese power, one of the most unique in all of history. And so, though TANGREN is a dynastic rather than an ethnic designation, the Tang were not a people, they were just the dynasty ruling China. This civilization designation makes too much sense not to include. The Chinese, as they currently are way too broad. This is one of the many areas where I find the Age of Empires 2 scheme of ethnic-based naming to be just completely flawed and misleading, because it forces the poor Chinese civilization to represent 1,200 years of history single-handedly and not do it very well, in my opinion. If you want to see my video on the topic of ethnic versus dynastic naming, take a look up here. I'm quite proud of it, though I made it a little while ago. And you could argue that maybe this dynastic designation makes this not qualify as a LAVAnilla civilization. Maybe, you could maybe argue that, but I don't care. And also consider that the Habsburgs were actually considered by the official dev team for the Conqueror's expansion way back in the day. So it's not like this is completely unprecedented. But with all that pedantry out of the way, let's talk about the history of the Tang dynasty. Our story begins in the 600s AD. The Sui dynasty is doing reasonably well, but they are having some trouble. What is that trouble? Korea, as well as the Western Turks. The Sui dynasty took over China in 581, but collapses in just 37 years, the shortest-lived major Chinese state in history. They were fighting a two-pronged war in Korea and in the West against the Turks, which drained their treasury and just made the government completely inviable. Rebellions pop up everywhere, and among those rebellions, the Tang emerge as the winners, originating roughly from the northwest of Sui territory, again possibly with Xianbei roots. As soon as they take power, the Tang quickly start launching wars to expand their territory, and unlike the Sui, they do it very, very well. They were quite successful, making use of the solid bureaucratic and infrastructural foundations laid by the Sui and capitalizing on them in a far leaner and more efficient manner. Their first order of business, secure the fledgling Silk Road, which meant they started to cast their eyes west. Another order of business, resolve the wars in Korea, which they did quickly, allying with Shilla to allow it to defeat Goguryeo and take over the peninsula. If you want to take a look at my video on Shilla, go take a look up here. I was really proud of it. Next, push back the Tibetans and smash the Turks, which they accomplished within just over a decade of taking power. And that was no small feat. The Tibetans were a very substantial power at this point, and the Western Turkish Khaganate was a formidable foe, but the Tang overwhelmed them both quite convincingly. In so doing, the Turks respected them so much that they even honored the then emperor as their great Khan. Between that and peaceful relations with Shilla in Korea, they hit a golden age within just a few decades of their founding, profiting off of the early Silk Road, surrounded by a group of allies that they had beaten into submission and now fought for them rather loyally. And they peaked in the 700s AD, with a massive military keeping their huge territory in check. In so doing, they started to interact with the far west, importing Arab and Persian culture, establishing contact with India, making foreign trade relations. They even fought the Abbasid Caliphate in Tokharistan. China versus the Abbasids. But that wouldn't happen for a while, and this success did not last forever. In the late 700s, a rebellion pops up, the An Lushan Rebellion in the north. This is a big deal, and it ends up causing some serious issues. It was led by Proto-Khitanic people. If you want to see my build on the Khitans, take a look at my Manchurian DLC proposal, a link up here. And the An Lushan Rebellion quickly spreads, forcing the emperor to flee, which is unprecedented for the Tang up until this point. They eventually put down the rebellion, but the Tang would never fully recover from here, with the Tibetans even seizing their capital at one point in the 760s, which was a serious blow, not to mention a major humiliation. And even though they restored authority in the 800s, returning some of their power, they would never recapture their golden age. And over the decades, the government starts to grow progressively weaker. Court politics got super messy, eunuch cliques caused serious destabilization, assassinations, and finally, a collapse in 907. It would be 50 years until the Song dynasty would pick up the pieces and reunite China, and then they would be seriously contested by the Khitan Liao dynasty in the north. So where are they now? Well, they're a dynasty. They're gone. But they set the standard of success for medieval China in the term TANGREN, I think, which roughly translates to Chinatowns, which existed all over medieval Asia and retained the Tang name even well after their collapse. Some of the institutions the Tang founded even lasted for over 1,000 years, and their golden age remains a much admired period of Chinese history to this very day. And so, I'd say they had a pretty good run of things. Now let's talk briefly about flavor, the lovely aesthetic details that make AoE2 civilizations special. Their language would be Ancient Chinese. This could be tough to research, but has some similarities to Cantonese, as well as the local dialects of Fujian province, as well as Taiwan. So you might be able to kind of blend some of those together to make something semi-compelling. Their ensign would be this sick Tang-era shield that I found, a direct mock-up of a period painting, which you can see down below. I think it looks beautiful and is really, really standout with its colors and design. Their architecture would be East Asian, though I'd love a China-specific set. The current East Asian architecture looks much more Japanese. And their wonder could be Fuguang Temple, which you can see a period rendition of here, while their castle could be Hanyuan Hall, for which you could use a restoration similar to what you see on screen right now. Lots of good architecture options for the Tang. Next, for a campaign, this was one of the hardest campaign picks I've ever had to make in a LAVAnilla video, but after a lot of hemming and hawing, I ended up going with Emperor Taizong. This really shouldn't have been that hard of a pick. Taizong is, after all, very arguably the greatest emperor in Chinese history. His birth name was Li Shimin, and he fought everyone. Like, he was responsible for the major Tang expansions that got them all the way out west and got them into and out of Korea. So you'd be fighting Tibetans and Tanguts and Shillans and Goguryans and Gokturks and the Xianbei, a bunch of civilizations that aren't yet made, and plenty that I have discussed on my channel before, including my recent video on the Tanguts. Go take a look at that up here. So Taizong was incredible. He was just a military genius. He led from the front, would make for a perfect campaign, but there was another very strong contender, namely Wu Zetian, the legendary Empress of the Tang. She is the most famous woman in Chinese history, I am going to make the argument. And if she were up against literally any competition besides Taizong, she would be the pick. But Taizong is just too legendary to be thwarted, even by Empress Wu. You could also consider Emperor Gaozu, Taizong's father, I'm pretty sure, who founded the Tang. But honestly, he has no chance against the above two. They are just too cool to be rivaled. And if you ended up going with Wu Zetian over Emperor Taizong, I wouldn't fault you. If you want to see some AI player names, take a look on screen right now. But I'm going to move swiftly along to major themes. Every time I research a civilization, I try to condense their history down to a couple of major overarching factors that I can use to inform their design. And for the TANGREN, here's what I came to. First of all, bureaucratic efficiency. They took the Sui system and improved it a lot. And they kept the government lean and efficient. This enabled them to get off the ground early on. It enabled very efficient control over their homeland and beyond. To the point where it's kind of hard to overstate just how important the Tang bureaucracy was to their success. Even if it's like less exciting and sexy than other topics in their history, their bureaucratic efficiency, I would attribute a lot of their success to. And therefore, I wanted to give them a town center bonus of some kind. I thought discounts of some kind made sense for them, and I wanted to give them an incentive to really spread out and build big bases full of buildings. Now, from here, the next major theme I wanted to talk about was their utterly enormous population and the huge territory they controlled. They ruled, at their height, 50 million people. That's incredible. And I should note that unlike some other huge empires of medieval history, like the Mongol Empire or something, the Tang were like very directly involved with their homelands, rather than just like riding through, smashing them up, forcing tribute and leaving. The conquered areas were heavily integrated into Tang society, and this promoted a great cultural exchange between the Tang and the people that they ruled. And this unprecedented openness allowed the Tang to get tech and culture from the rest of the world and really effectively use it, far more than in almost any other part of Chinese medieval history. So because of this, I felt like the TANGREN should have some way to get extra PopCap, with like big late-game flood strats, a big tech tree, and incentives to use the market and trade. Last major theme, highly militarized but decentralized. The Tang had a huge variety of troops, including their many conquered peoples, who, for example, contributed nomadic horse archers from their northern holdings. They were not really known for specific troop types. They just had like reasonably competent representatives in every regard, and their military authority was, especially later, more of a provincial matter. Which was very cost efficient, but eventually caused rebellions and inefficiency down the line. So because of this, I wanted the TANGREN to have a varied army with big discounts and lots of individually flawed units. So they have to make up for individual quality with quantity and variety. And with that, we come to the end of the history section. If that's all you watched for, thank you so much for taking the time. But for those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what Dennis and I did to translate Tang history into the TANGREN build here, let us move on to civ design. Beginning with an overview. The TANGREN, an infantry civilization, first bonus. Start the game with 2 free farms next to the town center. Like I said, they inherited the infrastructure and bureaucracy of the Sui dynasty and immediately put it to good use. And so how to represent that? Well, they start the game with a couple of extra farms that they can throw their villagers on for a slightly smoother start, get a little bit of wood savings, and similar. These little early game incremental benefits that can snowball into much greater effects down the line. And as you'll see, the TANGREN have a pretty unusual start because of a regional building, and so these extra farms are going to be especially valuable for them. Next bonus, Fu and castles each give +1 population cap. What the heck is a Fu? It is a town center regional variant. I'll get to that a little later, but for now, town center. Why this bonus? Well, like I said, the ballooning population of the Tang dynasty, enabled by their enormous conquest and provincial enforcement and regulation efforts. That lean bureaucracy was really, really important when it came to managing their enormous empire, and as such, if you can build enough castles and town centers, you are going to have a huge population advantage over your opponent. Big cities, lots of area control. Oh, and this population cap thing wouldn't be infinite. I see it capping out at like a maximum of plus 20 or so, so twice as good as the Goth bonus, but you need to do a lot more work to get there. Last bonus, Fu costs gold instead of stone. Again, Fu being a town center type building. This represents bureaucratic efficiency, plus the widespread minting of new currency. Way more town centers than other civilizations, without coming at the cost of additional castles or similar. Team bonus. Your first market, university, and caravanserai each discount all technologies by 5%. Yes, they do receive the caravanserai as a regional. This version would be no different from the current caravanserai, meaning that it would not normally be very helpful outside of team games, but even in a 1v1, building one of these bad boys is going to give you 5% off all of your techs, which is not too bad. So why this team bonus? Well, to represent the enormous cultural and technological exchange enabled by vast trade networks, their burgeoning scholarly class, and unprecedented openness. And it is, of course, kind of aping the existing Chinese tech discount bonus, but since this is a team bonus, it's harder to get there. You have to do more work to get it, but it is enabled for your allies as well. With their bonuses covered, let us discuss their unique units, beginning with their castle unique unit, the Shense, or, if I'm going to take a crack at the Mandarin here, the Shense. I think that's right. This is a heavy cavalry unit trained at the castle for 50 food and 40 gold. Quite cheap. Its stats are nothing to sneeze at. Looking on screen right now, you'll find that it has more HP than a knight and the same amount of pierce armor, but it's much, much faster than a knight, trained quite fast, has better attack, an attack bonus versus mounted archers, and it takes -3 damage from mounted units, exactly like royal heirs. That's really strong. However, it has an ability which drains -4 gold per minute from your stockpile as long as the Shense is in play. This means if you mass up a huge army of these guys, they are going to be stealing your gold. So you got to make use of them fast. Hence why they have such awesome stats for such a relatively tiny cost. I've done the math on this, and assuming a 1-to-1 food to gold ratio, this would take about 11 minutes in-game for the cost to equalize with a knight. To compare directly to a knight with bloodlines, this is way cheaper up front, is way better versus cavalry, is way faster, and has better DPS, but it drains gold, which is a big downside, right? It's way worse versus infantry, and of course it requires a castle. So I think it will be a genuine consideration whether you go for the Shense or you go for knights. Shense means Divine Stratagem Guard. They were a hyper-elite regiment, probably cavalry, that specialized in fighting mobile Turkic cavalry armies, which to me makes it very likely they themselves were cavalry as well. They were formed by a Göktürk defector. However, as the Tang Order broke down, the Shense were increasingly used as a cudgel between warring internal factions. This proud group of military elites descended to little better than thugs, roving the capital as enforcers for whatever eunuch last bribed them. Hence why I have them taking gold over time. Now, the Shense upgrades to Elite and Imperial Age for 700 food, 800 gold. It gets some relatively decent stat bonuses, including plus 10 HP, -3 second training time, 2 more attack, 2 more bonus damage, and -1 damage taken from mounted units. So overall, a very textured unit that you're not going to want to automatically mass up, but is going to be very helpful in many different circumstances. Next, their second unique unit is the Mo Dao, or to take another stab at the Mandarin, Mo Dao. This is a unique replacement to the two-handed swordsman, costing 500 food and 750 gold for 120 seconds to upgrade. Their stats are kind of an interesting middle ground between a two-handed swordsman and a champion, but you may notice that the Moldau has a couple of big differences with the normal swordsman line, such as higher speed and a massive attack bonus versus cavalry. To give a direct comparison with a champion, the Moldau has the big bonus versus cav. They have better speed, better rate of fire, and they are overall cheaper and faster to upgrade than a champion. But a champion has better HP, and the Moldau also takes more gold to upgrade overall. So generally they're still going to be better than a champ, but they are going to be slightly worse in some matchups. To compare the Moldau with the Legionary, which I think is a far better comparison, the Moldau is anti-cavalry, it has better DPS, and it's faster, all of which are big upsides. But the Moldau is way less tanky. It's worse versus infantry by a lot, and it's a bit more expensive and longer to upgrade. So I think you can think of the Moldau as kind of like a legionary that is specialized against cavalry and damage rather than infantry and tankiness. Unusual combination. Now, the Moldau is the name for an extremely long single-edged sword with a gentle curve, adopted by the Tang as an anti-cavalry weapon. It was long enough to actually be used like a spear. You hold the long handle and you point out the long blade and you impale a horse, right? But you could also hack out a horse's legs from under it, unhorse a rider, cleave through shields. It was a pretty powerful weapon. It was said to be able to hack through armor with relative ease, and it was most famously used by the Tang general Li Siye during the Tang Wars against the Abbasids, as well as the An Lushan Rebellion. Apparently, it was a blade that a good swordsman could make absolute mincemeat of people with, hence why I gave it higher rate of fire as well. So overall, a very interesting unit, probably the highest punch that any single Tang unit is going to have, though it has its flaws, especially its relative lack of tankiness to a champion. Now, from here, we're going to talk about unique techs and then regionals, because the first regional is very important. Unique technologies, however, are very relevant to this civilization as well, beginning with Fubing in Castle Age, or Fubing, I believe is how you do the Mandarin. This makes it so that your spear line, skirmishers, and scout line, your trash units, cost minus 33%, even better than the Byzantines. But your villagers take 50% longer to train. That's pretty unusual. 450 food, 450 gold, and again, this is in Castle Age. Now, what was Fubing? It was a conscription system that played an essential role during the early mid-Tang dynasty. This was kind of their secret sauce for how they were so effectively able to militarize during those early days of conquest. Farmers would serve as soldiers for several months a year as part of tax obligations, but they were required to purchase their own gear and were responsible for getting themselves from their farms to their training sites. So it put a lot of obligation on the farmers, but lightened their tax burden in other ways. And it meant that the Tang were able to conscript their soldiers very, very cheaply and effectively, and that those soldiers would be relatively well trained for being levies. However, it fell off in the mid-late dynasty due to the huge pressure it put on the economy as wars got out of control and started popping up during key growing seasons. Hence why I have it giving you an economic penalty once you choose to pick it up. You can think of Fubing as like a switch that you can flick once per game that turns you from eco mode to military mode. And the timing on that is going to determine what separates a good TANGREN player from a bad one. Imperial Age, you get Jiedushi, or Jiedushi. That one's really hard to pronounce. I'm pretty sure I fucked that one up, but pardon me. This makes so that your Fu, your town center replacements, provide plus 33% work rate, that's pretty much conscription, to nearby military buildings, and plus 2 attack to fortifications. This would cost 600 wood, 400 gold, and I forgot to mention this, but it would be like a 10 to 12 tile radius on this aura. The Jiedushi were military governors, initially appointed to manage far-flung border provinces, but eventually gaining enormous power and becoming like de facto local rulers or warlords. They were responsible for recruiting their own armies, maintaining fortifications, and autonomously conducting war, though they were, of course, subservient to the dynasty's own generals and similar, but that didn't stop them from getting uppity. The Jiedushi system was enacted during the mid-dynasty and did efficiently hold contested borders, but eventually it caused the military governors themselves to gain enough power that many tried to rebel. The An Lushan Rebellion was the most successful of these, with its leader, An Lushan himself, being a Jiedushi under Tang rulership. So, as you can see, between Fubing and Jiedushi, you are creating a disgusting late-game flood of primarily cheap trash. And though your economy is a little fragile because your villagers take longer to train, you get bonus damage on your fortifications, making you that much harder to raid. And remember, Jiedushi does not just benefit unit creation time, it also benefits tech researching, and applies to all military buildings, including castles. So it's a very versatile and powerful technology. That means you have to cluster your military near your TCs. Next, your regionals, beginning with the very important one, the Fu. This replaces the town center for Chinese civilizations, and it costs more than a normal TC, costing 150 food and 50 wood more than average. Though, of course, for the TANGREN, it would not cost stone, it would cost gold. You can think of the Fu as having the same stats as a TC, but with the following differences: more HP and attack scaling by age, plus 5 pop space for 10 baseline, plus 10 garrison space, and plus 25 seconds of build time. Now here's the big one. If a civilization has the Fu, they start the game with plus 2 villagers, but minus 150 food and minus 50 wood. A toned down version of the current Chinese start. I should emphasize, this is worse than the current Chinese start. You start with -1 villager and still start with a lot of resources down. But you have the additional pop space from the Fu itself, and the building does have another power that kicks in later in the game. Whenever you build a new Fu starting in Castle Age, it will also give you 2 free villagers, meaning that Chinese civilizations such as the TANGREN will have a great boom pretty much no matter what, though it does have a higher barrier to entry because the building itself is more expensive and takes a little longer to make. In all other ways, the Fu is identical to a town center, but this is a pretty big change, and will really give a leg up in the early game to any civilization who has it. What does Fu mean? It refers to a provincial capital, each presiding over a given region, usually the biggest city within that region. They were always smaller than the dynastic capital of the era, so Chang'an in the case of the Tang, but they were major power centers, highly urbanized and essential to Chinese regional bureaucracy. The reason that Dennis and I decided to design the Fu in this way is because the Chinese start is too thematic and appropriate to confine to one civilization. This gives it to all Chinese powers, while also softly nerfing their mid-game because of its higher cost and build time, as well as making the start less oppressive by itself, because you have fewer villagers and fewer resources lost at the beginning. It should also have beautiful graphics from Dark Age, just as a side note. Just please don't make the regional capital covered with hides. That would not make sense. Now, regional number 2. This one's less important than the Fu, but is still pretty fun and interesting. The Jinjuan, or Jinjuan. This is a heavy infantry trained at the castle in Castle Age for 20 food and 60 gold. You can only have 5 per castle in play at any given time, and has the following stats. Disgusting. It has huge HP and armor. You can think of it like a knight, but with higher armor. It also has great line of sight, but it takes long to train for a castle unit, and 0.66 speed, bringing it to the level of many siege weapons. That's awful. However, it has an ability. While within 12 tiles of a castle, Fu, or king, the Jinjuan gains +5 attack, plus 50% speed, making it about as fast as a pikeman, and plus 50 HP per minute regen. Gross. Absolutely disgusting. Jinjuan were, of course, imperial guardsmen, tasked to protect royalty and high-ranking officials, and have been prevalent in China since BC times. The Chinese Imperial Guard are an iconic part of its history throughout every single dynasty it has had, pretty much since, pre-AoE 2 times with the Han. And so, of course, they should be a regional for all Chinese powers. They were an essential part of court life and politics, serving as an entry position for young noblemen and often caught up in court intrigues. They are highly romanticized. They were clearly cool and badass. We definitely should be representing them in-game, though with substantial limitations. Yeah, their stats are absolutely repulsive, but they are, I'm going to say, almost unusable unless you are playing defensively. Now, the Jinjuan would upgrade into the Shenwu in Imperial Age. This is available at the castle for 300 food and 900 gold, and its stat benefits would be gross. Let's just be honest here. Plus 50 HP, +1/+1 armor, and +3 attack. But the speed is unchanged, and the aura benefits remain the same. Shunwu means divine warriors. It was one of the named Jinjuan regiments of the Tang Dynasty, though the name Shunwu was likely used for later regiments as well. And while I should note, while Imperial Guards were used on battlefields, they were not very common. And so while I don't want them dominating the battlefield and pub stomping people, that just wouldn't make too much sense, I like them being this niche unit that you can use either in masterpieces like castle drops or something like that, or on the back foot if you're playing defensively, or if you just want to meme around and murder people with a pseudo-Teutonic Knight. All of those are valid, and I think that even though this would probably not be a very meta unit and would probably be pretty bad in most cases, I think it'll still be fun, and there is a place in the game for that. Now, regionals done. Let's talk about their tech tree now that we have an idea of what the rest of the civilization looks like, beginning with their infantry. It is an A-. I forgot to include the Jinjuan here on this slide, but they have that. That's infantry. For the most part, though, you're looking at an almost perfect tech tree besides arson. You have the Moldau. You have extra population space if you build castles in Fu. You have discounted technologies through your team bonus, and both Fu Bing and Jie Duxi benefit all military units, but I'd say infantry especially because they really benefit from being spammed and getting discounts. I'd say an A-. I think an A is arguable. Next, archers. It's a B. They have a great tech tree, except for Bracer. That really hurts. I know, I like to remove Bracer from everyone. Sue me, it's fun. The only thing they miss besides Bracer, though, is Hand Cannon. Besides that, Fubing, Jadoshi, extra pop space, discounted text, it's great. If it weren't for missing Bracer, they could be argued to have an A-, but as is, I don't think they can get better than a B. Next, Cavalry. It's a B-. All the stuff I keep saying, they have all of those things that benefit all their military units, but they miss Bloodlines, which really hurts. And while they do have the Shinsadren, as well as Step Lancer, they miss all of their final cavalry upgrades, meaning that you're most likely going to be using their Shinsadren with light cavalry that are discounted to back them up. Overall, a B-, I think is fair. Next, Siege. Jadoshi benefits the Siege Workshop. They have extra pop space, discounted text, yada yada yada. They get Siege Engineers, and the only things they miss are Siege Onager and Bombard Cannon. Those are nasty misses for sure, but overall I still think it's worthy of a B+. Defenses, B+ as well. They have a slight extra incentive to build the university thanks to their team bonus. They get discounted technologies, which helps their defenses a lot. The Fu is a bit of a defensive building that they also have cost gold, meaning they have more stone for defenses. Really the only problem is they miss Bracer, which blows. But once again, Jadoshi kind of helps because you get more damage on your fortifications. It's kind of a tricky one, but I'd say a B+ is most fair. You could maybe argue a B. Navy, it's a C+. This one's a bit rough. They actually have a perfect tech tree besides Shipwright and Cannon Galleon, and they get extra pop space, discounted text. We love those, but no Bracer. It's a C+. Economy, it's an A-. You could argue Fubing is an anti-economy bonus, but you get to choose when that kicks in. And besides that, you have your Chinese start thanks to the Fu. The Fu will help you boom in mid-game. You have extra incentive to build the market and caravanserai. You get your tech discounts. You start the game with 2 free farms. That's a lot of benefits. A- feels fair. And lastly, Monks. They have a shockingly good tech tree. They don't have devotion, faith, or heresy, as a reference to the religious upheaval caused by them accepting then rejecting Buddhism. But besides that, just having redemption plus block printing by itself is pretty much worthy of a B+ single-handedly. And from here, now that we have an idea of their tech tree, let's talk about their game plan, or at least what I think will be their game plan. Their early game, I give a B. Yes, they have extra vills plus free farms. That's very good. That's an explosive start. But other than that, their early game is generic unless you get a market for 5% discount on all technologies. Also, their scouts miss Bloodlines, which tones down their rushing options pretty substantially. And remember, their Chinese start is less good than the current civilization. So overall, I think a B is fair for early game. You could maybe argue a B+, though it would be hard. Next, mid-game, it's an A-. They have a huge tech tree. They only miss a couple Castle Age options. And while booming with Fu can be very tempting, and you can do great stuff with that, you can also pick up Fubing early for a powerful all-in. You nerf your economy, but you get disgusting cheap trash units and can storm your enemy in Castle Age before they're even ready for you. They also have some scary but like micro-intensive options like the Shinsadren and even the Jindren if you want to try something like that. The Shinsadren in particular I think could really reward micro-intensive high-level play where you can make great use of them before they drain enough gold to like break even with a knight, and their speed by itself will make them a great raiding unit. Their late game goes back to a B, though it's kind of a nuanced B. Their whole tech tree is usable but flawed, except for their infantry, which are great, right? And you can flood your opponent with cheap trash and fast production thanks to your unique technologies and your bonus pop cap. You just have so much, like, flood potential in late game. That's good, but you're susceptible to raids because Fubing nerfs your villager production, and no single unit of yours is really a standout powerhouse except for, like, the Moldau, and that's an infantry unit that isn't very tanky. So overall, in late game, your flood is great, but there's going to be plenty of enemies you're going to have a lot of trouble cracking. More broadly, this is a very micro-intensive civilization. You have the Chinese start, you have your needy, unique unit, weird regionals, you just have a lot going on. They also play very poorly on the back foot. You need to use your explosive start to take control of the game. You also have fantastic versatility as the TANGREN, especially in the mid-game, though this comes at the cost of raw power. You have few, if any, true power units that you can spam and forget about. All of them have some sort of flaw, meaning that you need to combine your forces together to optimally use them. You do have a counter for pretty much everything under the sun, and that is nothing to sneeze at. Now, from here we come to the end of the design section for the TANGREN. Lastly, let's touch upon a couple of loose threads, beginning with some uncertainties. And I had a lot of uncertainties for this civilization. I'm genuinely worried this build is super overpowered. Chinese start is already an amazing bonus. The TANGREN get even more than just the Chinese start because they get the farms. My hope is that while they'll have a better Dark Age, that they'll lag the current Chinese in other ways. Because remember that the Chinese get the tech bonus discount thing for free from Feudal Age, and that's a really good early game bonus. So I'm hoping that the TANGREN don't just like blow people out because of having an almost Chinese start with upside past that. I wouldn't be surprised if it just proved too good though. The Fu building also feels a little bit stilted and maybe overpowered. I love the idea of a regional building conveying the Chinese start. Like, that's Dennis's idea, by the way, full credit to him for suggesting that. But between the high cost, the free villager spawns, the Chinese start, there might just be too much going on. So maybe there's a way to pare it down without killing the feel. But I don't want to remove it at all. So don't suggest it. The Jinjun also feels weird. It's like a big dumb stat stick, but it's probably unusable because of its awful speed. I see it kind of like the Ritual Boxer on my Chontao's build. Go take a look at that up here if you haven't seen it before. It's really fun. It's cool, it's thematic, but it's more there as like a meme unit and like a fun power fantasy for casual fans. Kind of like the old Teutonic Knight, which I was comparing it to earlier on. I think it's much worse than the current Teutonic Knight, unless of course you're fighting near a castle. If you guys have ideas on how to make it more of like an even-keeled unit, I'd love to hear, but I'm not super concerned. Like I said, I think it's more of a fun unit than something that will really be consequential in most circumstances. Another uncertainty, Fubing is a trade-off. People really seem to hate trade-offs. I could see it being received kind of like the button on Burgundians. It's way, way less intense than that, but it is like a, oh, sacrifice your economy for better military sort of thing. And I love the flavor. I'm quite reluctant to change that. But yeah, do you guys think Fubing would be received poorly? And similarly, I could see the Shenzhen being despised by casuals. The idea of a unit that just constantly slurps your gold sounds very annoying. But I think it's really thematic. I crunched the numbers to make it like a real trade-off, like a legit upside-downside consideration. But maybe there's a way to do it more elegantly. What do you guys think? And they don't have Bracer. How can you make a Chinese civilization that misses Bracer? Easily. And I think historically this was the best way to represent the dynamics of their military. They have tons of options but are a bit weaker than everyone else. So they miss a key technology on their archers, Bracer, and on their cavalry, Bloodlines, because they used both of those things and had a lot of them, but they weren't as good as their rivals. And this felt like the best way to do that. So what are some alternatives to some of the concerns I have here? I have no idea. A lot of the problems with this civilization are very vibes-based for me and are backed in flavor that I really like and don't want to remove. So I'd like to hear what you guys think about a lot of these concerns. And lastly, the LAVAnte-Garde section. If you're new to the channel, these are ideas that break the mold of AoE2 or are just like a bunch of extra ideas I couldn't fit into the build. So take a look on screen, enjoy what you see. I've been trying my best to get the pinyin right for the Mandarin in this build, and God, pronouncing it has been rough, so apologies if you're a native speaker. Something that I wanted to highlight in the LAVAnte-Garde section here is the idea of like one-time promo units that like you train this garbage trash unit, right? And you can promo it into one of any of the three main trash, Skirm, Halb, Light Cav, but only once. So you have these like recruits that maybe can build fortifications or something, then you can turn into trash units immediately. I thought that would be sick, and I really liked the idea, but it turns out after talking with my mod squad, it is probably not implementable, tragically. So pause the video now if you want to take a look at more LAVAnte-Garde ideas. I had a lot of them for this build. But with all that said, we come to the end of this TANGREN build. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. Let us take a look before we end at the good old Likeliometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that the TANGREN or a similar Tang Dynasty civilization could be added to the game, maybe looking a little something like this build? And on the Likeliometer for today, we have a 5 out of 10. I think it's unlikely, but not impossible. The Chinese are a pretty ridiculous umbrella, and while I think some people could say, oh, just add the Jurchens and Khitans, though they aren't Chinese. So I think that we need something to split up the big dynasties, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a good amount of appetite for that, but I don't see it being a high priority. In fact, 5 out of 10 might be a little high. Maybe a 4 or 3 would be more likely. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear what you guys think. How did you like the build? How did you like the dynastic approach to this civilization and a bunch of the more unconventional mechanics we used on this? Anything you do differently in a Tang Dynasty design? And what do you want to see next on the channel? Would you like to see more of a breakup of the core Chinese dynasties of the Middle Ages? Because the Song and the Ming are certainly waiting, and I would love to tackle them at some point with the help of my good friend Dennis. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.